All right, I believe we are about ready to start. Now, this evening we're going to be looking at examples of secondary progressions. And secondary progressions are based on the apparent movement of the planets through the zodiac. This means they are based on the orbital revolutions of the planets, and especially the orbital revolution of the Earth, because the orbital revolution of the Earth is what makes the sun appear to move through the zodiac day by day, degree by degree. So we're going to be looking at predictions and forecasts based on the axial rotation, which are a totally different thing. We'll be doing that eventually at another time. Now, what we're doing now is very different from what we did with the transits. In fact, everything is, how do you say it, delayed or scaled. The transits are more direct. If a planet in the heavens forms a geometric relationship with a planet in the horoscope, it is effective at that time, directly at that time, immediately. However, if a planet in the heavens forms a geometric relationship with a planet in the horoscope, with progressions, it takes a while for those to take effect. This is like saying some activities are in one's lifetime mature. In fact, you can look at the whole horoscope maturing. It's all there in the moment of birth, but it matures and we get opportunities to change things or bring things out more thoroughly or get more out of life. Now, birth is the initial action, and that sets all of the other actions in motion. The scale of change in almost all methods of forecasting and prediction is based on 1 degree. Now, since the Earth moves approximately 1 degree every day in its orbital revolution, and since secondary progressions, in them 1 degree equals 1 year, the apparent motion of the sun is approximately 1 degree per year. Thus, a life of 90 years, the secondary progressions for that will be in the first 90 days after birth. Now, in those 90 days, the outer planets don't move very much. If you get something like Neptune or Pluto, it doesn't seem like they've moved at all. From this, we can understand that the progressions that are associated or activated by outer planets don't happen very much, that there's a big change. You can see some with Jupiter after a person has lived 20 or 30 years. You can see that. Now we're going to eventually spend some time on outer planet progressions. Normally the term outer planets means all of the planets outside of the orbit of the Earth. And normally inner planets mean all of the planets inside of the orbit of the Earth. And since we consider the sun and the moon planets for astrological sake, just to have a simple language to work with, the inner planets include Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Moon. Now, the inner planets are usually more important in secondary progressions because they move enough to manifest significant change. Now, the inner planets move much too swiftly to be used in transits in any practical way. Lunar transits, any lunar transit only lasts a few hours at most. And since the duration of an astrological significant event is an important thing, this is why the things that move more slowly are in orb of something long enough to have an effect. So duration is important. The longer the influence is in effect, the greater the influence is going to be. Now Mars is different from all of the other planets. We haven't mentioned it with outer planets or inner planets. It actually moves fast enough to form progressions that you can experience. However, it moves slowly enough also to form transits where there is a recognizable influence. So you might consider Mars as some kind of an interloper that works as both a transiting planet and as a planet that is significant in progressions. Now, Mars transits are usually reinforcing, or they provide a trigger for other transits. Now, in the examples that we're going to be working with tonight, we're going to be looking at solar progressions. And the reason for this is that after many years of experience, it is obvious to me that solar progressions are usually the most significant progressions. Progressions of Mercury or progressions of Venus usually not so strong. However, if the progressions of inner planets change in significance according to the strength of the planet in the natal chart. Suppose somebody has an extremely strong Venus and is a very loving, artistic, social person, then the Venus progressions would be stronger than would normally be expected. Now, since Venus and Mercury move more swiftly in average than the Sun, their duration of orb is not going to be as long as the solar progressions. Now, the Moon is radically different than all of the other astrological significators. In fact, we'll have at least one, but probably several sessions on the Moon in transits and in progressions and in lunations and all sorts of things, because in applied astrology, the Moon is very important. Now, when we're considering progressions, it's a matter of judgment how large the orb of influence is. You remember that in natal horoscopes, the orb of influence for an aspect is 6 degrees. And if it gets beyond 6 degrees, it's maybe not there. And what is considered a valid orb of influence for progressions varies from astrologer to astrologer, and unfortunately it becomes a matter of opinion more than a matter of observation. You should never give up on observation with regard to astrology, and if it looks like a progression may be in effect, if you look at what's happening in the person's life, that's a more significant thing than to have an opinion about whether it is within orb or not within orb. Now, according to most astrologers, in fact, almost all astrologers, the orb of influence that I use is very small. I use an orb of influence of 1.5 degrees. And that means if the Sun is applying to some kind of aspect, it takes 1.5 years to apply until culmination, and then another 1.5 years in separation before the before the influence wears off. And so I have, this week I did some studying of other astrologers to see what they were saying, and I couldn't believe it. One was talking about 6+ degree orbs of a square to the moon's nose, and that was laughable to me. I would have flunked that person right away if I gave grades. All right. Events. Aspects don't always produce, progressed aspects don't always produce events. And when they do, usually it's close to the culmination, when the orb is almost exact. But it varies from individual to individual. You should get a track record by looking at past events with regard to past astrological conditions. Some people are of such a nature that they precipitate events ahead of time to get them over, and some people have the events almost seem like an afterthought or an after effect or something like that. So these are things that you want to do. All right, we're now ready to start looking at examples, and what that means, you don't have to look at me for the rest of the evening. Okay, that is about as good as I can get to focus, and I think it's large enough so that it should be taking up most of your screen. This is again it's my chart, so that's what we're going to be working with, just as we did with the transits. All right. Ooh, okay. Okay. I dropped I had a mic drop. I'm sorry. Well, I'll just have to leave it out somewhere. All right. By now you've looked at the chart, and it's like they used to say in poker games, read them and weep. It's usually not a good idea to expose your horoscope publicly. If you do so, you're baring your soul to the public, and that can be lead to all kinds of treacherous effects. And it's something like having a plant and bearing its roots. It stunts and it harms the life and development of the plant. However, soul things usually develop better without external exposure. Sometimes even internal exposure is difficult in that you're thinking about what's going on inside of you too much. However, since I'm an old person, this is not likely to be a problem with me. And there's even a benefit to this in that it means that there are more examples to draw from. I've had a long life, and there are plenty of examples to draw from. All right, let's see. All right. Now, what I'm doing with my horoscope right here as an instruction process is something that everyone should do in private with their own horoscope. From time to time, They should sit down and see what's going on with the progressions and the directions and the transits and all of those things. And because see what happens is with a lot of people, we're so focused on the things that happen outside to us. And for many people, life just happens to them. And the meaning of it isn't immediately available to them. And people just respond or just react more than respond. They react, and they react often habitually because their character is habit bound. Now, in fact, sometimes events in life even distract people from processing and contemplating the meanings of their lives. I had one friend once that if we would do something, we'd go for a walk or something like that, that friend would take a half a day in solitude and silence to process everything that happened. And I think that's an excellent way of living if you can afford that amount of time or you can make it somewhere. Now, the meanings of life and the things that happen in life for most people are not processed until after death. The material is not lost. Nothing is ever lost. Even if the body is burned and the etheric record is lost, there's still another record in the world of thought, but it's going to be a long time before you'll be able to take advantage of that. So experience is not lost, but the ability to process it and get the meaning of it and be able to apply it, if you have to wait until after death for that to happen, you won't be able to apply it until your next life. It's much more efficient in the process of soul growth and self-becoming if you sit down from time to time and try to understand what's going on. And when doing this, the horoscope is an excellent example because the horoscope is sort of like an externalized mirror of the soul. What's going on inside you can see in the horoscope, and it may not show readily externally. All right, we're about ready to begin with the sun. The sun is in the second house. It's in Scorpio. It's not quite conjoined to the dragon's head. The sun represents identity, and it represents both self and personal ego, which is something that requires interpretation. And since our identity, the center of our being, is what we want to understand, that's why we're working first with the solar progressions. Now in this horoscope, if we look at the sun natally, it is opposite to Uranus. It is applying to an opposite to Uranus. And because Uranus, I don't know if it shows, yes, it is retrograde. And if Uranus is retrograde, it means it's bringing on the aspect in the same way that the sun is, it's backing into it at the same time that the sun is going forward into it. That's called double application. Now, the sun is at 11 and some minutes, and it's in the early 12th degree. And Uranus is at 16, but it's very late minutes, so it's late in the 16th degree. So that means that the orb of this aspect is mild, or moderate at most, but most likely mild. Now, what we want to see is what happened after the sun came opposite to Uranus exactly. That is to say, at around age 5 or thereabouts, it culminated in opposition. So before that and after that, there was some influence. So we want to understand what happened to this person at the age of 5. Now, at this time in history, in educational circles, there was a debate about children who were born in autumn. if you put them in school at age 5, they might be a little behind, but if you had to wait until another year, they would be past the ideal age of age 6. So with my parents, it was decided that I should enter school at age 5. So the event that relates to the sun coming opposite to Uranus in this horoscope was the starting of grade school. Now, starting grade school usually marks the end of what would be called early childhood. Now, early childhood is indicated by the first house, and we have Virgo on the cusp, and Neptune is conjoined the cusp, so this is a rather sensitive, retiring type of child, not somebody who's going to be out and daring. I guess I was a sensitive, inward, and very imaginative person. And the way it was is we lived on a small farm, and the nearest neighbor kids were a quarter of a mile away. And so there was not much socialization in early childhood except for Sunday school once a week and once now and then a house visit or something like that. Now, this speaker had an extremely imaginative childhood. The Neptune is opposite the moon, and that's really strong imagination. We're going to have a lot to say about that the next time we meet, more than this time. A little later on, as the ascendant progressed more toward Mars, in the latter part of early childhood, the Mars kicks in, and there was a lot of competition with my older brother. Mars is opposite to Saturn, and planets that Mars aspects, especially Venus in the 3rd house, which is brothers and sisters. So there was love between us, but there was also competition. Now, Saturn figures in as a matter of age, thwarting the martial nature. That is, an older child is further in natural development. And the younger child can't possibly compete because, my brother was 4.5 years older, and you're trying to compete with someone who's 4.5 older is not an easy thing to do. And my brother was very conventional, many ways Taurus. And me, being so imaginative, I had even an invisible friend, and my brother tried to destroy that invisible friend, and he never could. And the strange thing is that the invisible friend that I had was a Negro. And I had never seen a Negro in my life, and I had never talked to one until many years later when I went to college. So this is what was happening in the early childhood, and this is why there is quite a change when I get to grade school. And with going to grade school coincided with the sun coming opposite to Uranus. Now, I went to a one-room school. At the highest enrollment for all 8 grades plus the teacher was 12. And so everybody was in everybody else's class all at the same time. Now, where I went to school, the kids were farm kids. And most were from poor to lower class families. And in this area, the soil was poor. It was clay on top of gravel, basically. And usually when the soil is poor, the farmers in that area are not very bright. The bright farmers get better land. And so that was the case where we were. Now, some of the kids in the school were not very bright. You've heard of hillbillies. Well, we were farm billies. Some of the children in the school, like one family had 3 daughters, and one of the daughters would put a stick into the outdoor toilet and chase people around with it. And another one had a sort of Pavlovian existence, that when she heard a bell ring, she sang dirty songs in either German or English. A lot of German-speaking people in this area. So what I'm trying to say is that most of the people in the school were not very intelligent. My brother and I were pretty much the exception. And my brother, through his conventionality, my brother was and is an excellent student. He got, great grades all the way through graduate school. So we sort of stood out because of intelligence. Now, because I was younger and had to forge a different path to compete with him or at all, I became a sun opposite Uranus person. In school, I was sort of an oddball, a lovable oddball, but I was not your normal everyday person. Now, at home, we didn't have a highly educational home life. We didn't do a lot of reading. We played board games and things like that. There was no television. We listened to the radio some. Even so, our learning development was faster than the people around us. Now, the sun opposite Uranus is rebellious. And in my rebellion, I was not a good student. I was even mildly to moderately non-cooperative. So I rebelled against education basically through all of my years in school, all the way through college. I rebelled. Now again, none of this was serious or pathological, but it was seminal to developments that took place later in life, which were both positive and negative. So we can see then, this is the first solar progression, is the sun opposite Uranus, and we can see what it was in making me a standout, oddball kind of child, and that's what happened. All right, now the sun progressed forward till around 22 degrees of Scorpio. And when it got there, there was a double whammy. Part of the double whammy was that by progression, the sun came square to Jupiter. And the sun came sextile to Neptune. So we had 2 progressions cotaneously active. Now, this was, mind you, I'm still in grade school at this point. In fact, not very far in grade school. Now, my brother was 4.5 years older than me, and my sister was 6 years younger than me. So there was a gap that I was in grade school, and my brother wasn't there, and my sister wasn't there either. So what happened is when my brother went to high school, his conservative nature, which balanced, it was a balancing, restraining thing to me, was removed. And that allowed the sun square Jupiter to take place. In fact, instead of just being an oddball, I became sort of a rebellious school clown. The teachers hated it, but I was clever enough to find ways to get away with it. I think seriously underneath it all, they loved me. But that might all be wishful thinking. Now, it wasn't destructive rebellion. It was more like goof-off rebellion, doing silly, absurd things. Now, when the Sun square Jupiter kicked in, this opened two character faults that are in my character and have been with me all the way to the present. It was the inauguration not only of there's a vague T-square between Sun, Uranus, and Jupiter. Sun is opposite Uranus, and Uranus is square Jupiter, so by association the Sun gets a square effect with Jupiter. But by orb, the Sun forms a square to Jupiter, and so all of these things, this mild T-square and the moderately strong Jupiter square Mercury, all kicked in at the same time. Now, what happened is that without the restraint of my brother, that Saturnine quality, overdoing kicked in. In the natal horoscope, Saturn is the weakest planet. And Saturn is the one that restrains and uses caution. And Saturn is sort of like a governor on a machine. It protects the machine from overdoing and blowing up with too much activity. So when my brother was gone, I could become, I could overdo things. Now, one of the things that goes along with overdoing is a sort of laziness. And that laziness leads to carelessness. This is a personality that is sometimes careless. The ruler of the zodiac, ruler of the chart is Mercury, and being square to Jupiter, it indicates a kind of carelessness and sometimes even sloppiness. Now, none of these things, again, has been serious enough to be pathological, but they persist and have continued to persist until the present. Now, the Sun-Jupiter combinations in dynamic astrology or natal astrology indicate laziness. So what happened was not I only became careless and overdid things, I became a lazy student. And that laziness was with me all of my life. At one time in this period when the Sun was square to Jupiter by progression, in arithmetic, I got a D with 5 minuses behind it, which means the teacher didn't want to fail me. You know, failure was happening because some of the kids in the school were not very bright, and sometimes they got failed. One of my chums in school got failed by his own sister. His own sister was the teacher. So it wasn't because of inability that I got a D in math, because later on I became a math major in college. Now, another character fault that was manifest at this time, and that also persists until the present, is wastefulness. It's obvious that if you overdo things and you're careless, you're going to be wasteful. You're going to have too much of something. So it's sort of the flip side of overdoing, a similar flip side. Now, I'm a person that was very much an overdoer. And with the Sun natally being in the second house, I was greedy. I was greedy for just about everything. Later on, it became a greed for expression. But as a child, I was greedy about food. My mother would say, "Your eyes are bigger than your stomach." She said that to me numerous times. And so what happened is I was wasteful. Now, a good example of this wastefulness in this period, you'd be surprised the images that come back to me as I'm doing this for this class, was lunches. we all carried lunch boxes. All the kids in the school carried lunch boxes to school. And we had healthy food. We had homemade bread, we had homemade preserves, we had homemade cake, we had homemade sausage, and all of things like that. But the funny thing was, I didn't like my lunches, so I didn't eat them. I didn't eat them most of the time. I didn't eat even part of them. Instead, I was ashamed of this. Even as a child, I had that Scorpio guilt, and I was ashamed of it. But what I would do is I would take my lunches and I would throw them out for the animals and the birds to eat. See, well, I walked a mile and a half to school, so I was in nature all the time. All right, so we can see this is what happened with the Sun being square to Jupiter by progression. Now let's look a little bit at the Sun being sextile to Neptune by progression. This was much more subtle, and that you expect that because Neptune is involved, and Neptune is in the 12th house. Even on the ascendant, it's going to be hidden. And I was way too young to think about self-identification, but it did have that kind of effect. Not that I became self-conscious, but I was inwardly active in my own idiosyncratic way. I had my own language of images. It was an imagistic language personal to myself. Now in this horoscope, Neptune is highly imaginative. The moon is imaginative, and the moon is in Pisces, which is imaginative, and both the Sun and Mercury are in a water sign, and that leads to imagination. So, what happened is I developed this personal language of images. I had inner impressions of things, especially human faces, and that is to this day. That if I meet someone, I get an impression of the face, and it becomes internalized with that strange kind of impressionization. Now, at this time, I came into being as an ambivert. An ambivert is somebody who is both an extrovert, which was sort of like the Sun being square to Jupiter at this time, and an introvert, which is like the Sun being sextile to Neptune. To this day, I still am an ambivert, but at this period in life, in the last few years especially, I think aging has something to do with it, I have become much more introversive, and a good day for me is when I see no one or speak with no one. Now, in saying these things, it has to be repeated often that none of these things is extraordinary. I wasn't extraordinary in any way at all in life. So this was a normal childhood, and I think a lot of children have their own language. If you read George MacDonald books, and George MacDonald had a very good sense of little children, he knew about the subjective languages that little children have. I had good parents. They were not educated very well. My mother had an 8th grade education, and my father had a 6th grade education. I was mostly happy, but in some of these Neptune periods, when the Sun was sextile to Neptune, I was a little morose. Never depressed, but dark. All right. But by the time of the progressions of Jupiter and Neptune that we're talking about, the Sun had already progressed into the 3rd house. And the 3rd house is a house of elementary education. It's also the house of siblings. And Mercury is in that 3rd house, and it is the strongest planet in the horoscope. Now, activity described the bigger parts, a part of the early childhood, and more as the childhood wore on, I was very active. And one of the ways of activity was rebellion. And it was during this period in life that the rebellion was very strong and it was very detrimental. Because my brother, when he went to high school, discovered his way in life. He found music, and all of his life he was and has been. He's 90 years old now, and for the first time he is not, at age 90, he is not playing a musical instrument. I was urged to take up an instrument, but again that rebellious nature set in, and I made one of the greatest errors of my childhood. I rebelled against taking music lessons of any kind, and that was a huge mistake. I tried later in life, but if you don't develop those things early in life, it's more difficult, and then I always had too many responsibilities to do it. So, in one sense, in terms of education, rebellion has not been his friend, but it also had a strong positive, but we haven't come to that yet. Now, let's pause before we move on to the next progressions, and just note that we haven't talked about any standout events. If entering school is an event, but it's not a standout thing like having an accident or something like that, or of being distinguished with some great honor. None of those sorts of things have happened. Now we want to look at that astrologically, because astrologically there are reasons for this. We remember that transits are responses to external conditions. Conditions in the three-dimensional world. And in the three-dimensional world, things are more specific. Your business ends where my nose begins, meaning to say there's an exact, the nose has an exact location. In the inner world, where the progressions are active, things are usually not so specific. They're more fluidic, even fluent, that things, emotions flow and thoughts go by real rapidly, things like that. We may have intense inner periods with high points, but they usually aren't as sharp. Even when we talked last time in the transits, or in one of the last sessions about the transits, we talked about the mystical experience that I had when the Neptune transited over my sun. Now in this chemical external world, it's here as a proving ground. And this is where things get finalized. And this is where things get tested. And so when we're talking about transits, we're talking about that sort of thing. And we expect more of those finalizing kinds of experiences. Not like the changing of our minds or even specific thoughts we can change. And emotions we certainly change a lot. So we can expect that with progressions there are likely to be fewer events, because events are external things. Now, events, when there are events, can be foreseen with secondary progressions. But foreseeing them is not as simple as when a transit culminates. We have to weigh all of the astrological factors. There are a lot of astrological factors that culminate in events. Now we're eventually going to go into that in more detail, but I want to talk about something about how I'm going to give a negative image, but you can find a positive image as well. But progressions, whether they result in an event or not, are something like a pimple or a boil. If there's a buildup of toxic stuff in your body and there's hormonal cooperation, it gets to be too much for the normal means of elimination. And it can't handle it all. So the skin is forced to become more of an organ of elimination than is normal or than is intended to be. And so there's a buildup of gunk, and pimples or boils build up, and you have a lump, a red sore lump, and the body is trying to rid itself of them. Now sometimes the pimple develops into a head, and then it pops. Now popping is like an event. Like a progression is like the development of the pimple, and popping it is like an event. You can do the same thing. You can find the same thing with positive examples. I just happen to have pimples in my mind, I guess. Now, not all pimples develop heads, and not all pimples pop. Sometimes the body catches up, the organs of elimination catch up, and the pimple recedes and it goes away and you don't have it. The same thing with a boil. And that's what a progression is like. There's a period where something builds up, and there may be an event, but there may not be an event, but it's still an indication of something going on, whether it is something positive in the body or whether it is something negative in the body. Now, if we look at the planets in the natal chart that are involved in the progressions as far as we've gone, Uranus, Jupiter, and Neptune, we see that none of them is exceedingly strong. Probably Neptune is the strongest, but it's not really strong. So it isn't a monster of influence. So we can see that big events relative to these progressions are not likely. So the planets and aspects indicate characteristics and personality traits, and they are triggered by the progressed sun. We've just seen attitudes of wastefulness and carelessness and introspective qualities that I have. They were triggered and came into being in my being during this period that we're talking about, and they are effective. But there didn't have to be an event. It doesn't always have to be an event. In some cases, it's better if there isn't an event. It says that you don't have to carry things to an extreme in order to develop what needs to be developed. All right. Now we've looked at progressions with planets that are not so strong. Now we have to look at aspects by progression that are strong. All right. Where the sun eventually came to conjoin Mercury. It's about age 15. So you can see if between 14 and 17 that the progressed sun conjoins Mercury. And at the same time, since Mercury and the moon are in a very strong trine, a progressed trine to the moon took place at the same time. So we have a double whammy again. Only this double whammy is much more important because Mercury is the ruling planet and it is by far the strongest planet in the horoscope. The moon happens to be the second strongest in the horoscope. If you want to know how strength is weighed, you can take either the intermediate or advanced courses that are available through my website. They're long, takes a lot of time, but there's a whole section on estimating strengths. Now, since these planets are so strong, and we're going to be looking at their progressions, let's look at them a little bit natally. First, just to understand what they're about. Mercury is stronger than any other planet in the horoscope. It's strong because it's in the very strongest aspect, the Mercury trine the moon. It's strong because it forms the most aspects. Mercury trines the moon. Mercury squares Jupiter. We've talked about that. Mercury sextiles Neptune. Mercury trines Pluto. Mercury sextiles the ascendant. and by association with the trine to Pluto, it has a vague conjunction to Venus. Now that's a big pile of aspects. You can see that for that reason and that reason alone, Mercury is strong. Then Mercury rules the ascendant and it rules the 10th house, and those are called the primary angles. And they are influential points, so that's another reason Mercury is strong. And Mercury is the abstract ruler of the 3rd house in which it is situated, and that's another reason why it's really strong. So this horoscope, you might say, is all about developing and using the 3rd Mercury. And Mercury being in the 3rd house, it means that I'm meant to talk. I may sometimes do too much of it, and I'm meant to write. It's kind of hard to write too much because editors always chop you down. All right. Now let's talk a little bit, very little bit, about the Mercury aspects. The Mercury trine moon is about completing thoughts in mental images. For mystics, a thought that does not have a thought form as an image is an incomplete thought. When you produce a thought form that has an image that is testable and triable, then you have completed the thought. So the moon is about forming images. Mercury trine moon is also about delineating images. If you see a picture or if you see a setting or something like that and you delineate it, you put it into words or you put it into a line of thought. Mercury square Jupiter is about excessive abstraction. Especially in my 20s and 30s, I had a very bad case of Platonitis and I wanted everything to be abstract. And Mercury square Jupiter is about prolixity, talking too much. And we all know about that. I'll often say, well, we're going to have a short class tonight. It's only going to last a short while, and then it lasts an hour and a half or more. Mercury sextile to Neptune is all about tuning in spiritually, and when you tune in spiritually, you can flow. He who reads may run. You tune in on a spiritual impulse, and you can just flow. It's sort of like a jazz musician given a chord progression and tuning in on it and just having a wonderful long solo. Mercury sextile Neptune is also all about the mystery schools. And all of my life I've been deeply interested in the mystery schools. That's, the mystery schools is how I came into studying astrology. Mercury trine Pluto is about fixing on a thought and staying with it. Usually I like to fix on absolutes which cannot be answered, but every time I go back to the well of an absolute, it gets answered. Mercury trine Pluto is all about influence, being able to think with influence, giving influence or receiving influence. I've had both in my life. Venus roundly conjunction, Mercury roundly conjoined or vaguely conjoined to Venus is about persuasion. Finally, Mercury sextile the ascendant is about observation. And that is something that is growing in my life, and it keeps to continue on that way. And Mercury sextile the ascendant with a Virgo ascendant is all about thinking about the physical body, which I sometimes do way too much to the edge of hypochondria. All right, now I have a rough idea of what is being activated. We could have done the same thing with the moon, but it would have been too much and we would have been here way too long. So, all right. This is the way it worked out with me, and as it works out with many people. Now, despite being a rebellious oddball, I was mostly inward. as well as having an invisible friend, I had a strong inner language. I'd talk to myself, but I didn't think of it in terms of a self. But there was something like a self. It was an almost unconscious self-awareness, which is not like an adult waking self-consciousness. I'll give you the perfect example of it. When I was a small child and they would show me a photograph of my body, or I'd look in the mirror, I did not think that the mirror image or the photograph was me. I had this inner reckoning, and I had this inner liaison with myself, and that was what I really was. And I was stubborn about it, pig-headed, and they would try to convince me that that was me in the photograph. Unfortunately, as I got older, I began to listen to them. But I was adamant. I had that Mercury trine Pluto adamancy about me. All right. Now, awaking from that dreamy state occurred in 3 stages. I had 3 events or 3 periods in life that were waking. The first one occurred at this time in life. What happened when the progressed sun was conjoined to Mercury? What happened is that we moved from the farm to a small town, and I had to. It wasn't unusual for me that I didn't have many friends because I never had many friends on the farm. There weren't friends around. So this happened the first 6 weeks of high school, and so I went to high school in this small town. And at the time of this period was in the second half of my high school career. Now, in the first half of my high school career, I was a mediocre to poor student, not very good at all. And then I took geometry, and I took math courses, advanced math courses, and that was the first step in awakening. I was a social misfit, and I didn't fit in with people anyway, even when I got to be known, but it didn't matter. I was excited to go to school because of geometry. I loved it. And so that was the beginning of an awakening. And that is what is associated with the sun coming by progression, coming into conjunction with Mercury. Now, the other event at around the same time was the moon event. And the other event took place in a section on geography. And in this section, we were to create an island anywhere in the world, and then we were supposed to have the geography of the island, its geology, its climate, its kind of products it would have, and things of that nature. And I loved it. And I created a Madagascar-sized island, which is almost like a subcontinent. And I had it in the Pacific Ocean, just off of Southern California and northern Mexico. And it wasn't until many years later that my mind was blown when I started reading books from writers of the mystery schools when they talk about the reformation of the North American continent. And the North American continent is going to be reformed so that the Mississippi Valley, like the Gulf of Mexico, will go up the Mississippi Valley all the way past St. Louis, and there will be a great depression in the center of the United States, which will be eastern United States and western United States. These are massive earth changes, and the Great Lakes will dump into the Mississippi River. At the same time, a lot of the west coast is going to sink all the way to the Wasatch Basin. Will be underwater. I guess the Sierras will be something like a chain of islands. But off of what is now Southern California and northern Michigan, a large Madagascar-sized island is going to form, and it's going to be called Aquaria. And this is where people are going to congregate that are going to be developing the kind of consciousness that will proliferate through all of humanity in the Aquarian age and beyond. And as I started reading all of these books, what my geography experience was what the mystery schools had. So this is one of these things, you can tune in on things. I tuned in on things that would later occupy quite a bit of my thinking. So, all right, this is about as far as we're going to go this evening. We'll continue on from here. And we've had exactly an hour, which is just nice and not exhausting. And we'll continue on, and we'll begin looking at the rest. I think we should be able to cover all of the rest of the solar progressions, and then we'll start looking at other progressions. But I think you get the idea of how you can see your life and how the characteristics that have been with you from birth, how the solar progressions or other progressions develop things that are coming from within and working out into the world. We remember that transits work from the outer world in, and progressions usually work from the inner world out. There are exceptions to both of them. But I think you have an idea of what we're trying to do, and I hope it's helpful to you. And I hope you start practicing doing some of these things yourself, because I think you'll find it very enlightening, and you'll get a better understanding of the purpose of it all. We haven't really talked about the purpose yet, but there is a purpose to all of these things in my life, but I don't know if I want to talk that much about what the purposeful part of my life is. So thank you very much. That will be it for this evening.